Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Joe Sternberg and Alicia Finley. Well, we've got a tentative deal between Ford Motor Company and the United Auto Workers. And boy, is the UAW happy. They have touted this. Shawn Fain, the UAW president, and Vice President Chuck Browning are dancing in the streets, or so they claim to be, more or less, as they announce this recall of their workers from the sidelines to go back to work at Ford. They're still on strike against Stellantis and General Motors, but they really like this deal. Let's listen to Mr. Browning talk about their strategy.
We are calling on all Ford strikers to go back to work while we vote on our tentative agreement. Like everything we've done in this stand-up strike, this is a strategic move to get the best deal possible. We're going back to work at Ford to keep the pressure on Stellantis and GM. The last thing they want is for Ford to get back to full capacity while they mess around and lag behind.
So this is the first time that the UAW has struck all three automakers at the same time. They usually would negotiate a contract with one first and then hope that carried over to the others. This time they've struck strategically, not across the board at all the companies, but strategically. And Ford is the first one to do a deal. You've looked at the details of this, Alicia. What do you make of it? Is the UAW right that they really have come out the winner?
I think that they got a quite sweet deal, a 25% raise over 4 years. And in addition to that, they'll get cost of living adjustments. And they estimate that that'll actually lead to raises in the neighborhood of 30 to 35% over 4 years. And that would be more than they have received over the last 22 years.
In total?
In total.
Really?
So that's quite striking. Again, they have complained that their wages haven't kept up with inflation the last few years, which is true. And that's ironically owing to the collective bargaining agreements that unions negotiate and like non-unionized plants that can actually increase wages with inflation or can reward workers for, doing a better job. Unionized workforces are kind of stuck.
Locked into the collective bargaining agreement.
But they got quite a nice deal. They also got the return of the cost of living adjustments, which were eliminated in the aftermath of Ford didn't get bailed out, but GM Chrysler did. And so those were eliminated back in 2009. They got eliminated the two-tier wage structures, which brought newer workers in under lower wages. And so that, again, was also a post-2007 change that they were able to eliminate. They also increased the starting rate by 68%. They increased pay for the temp workers. They actually got some kind of deal on the pension benefits. They didn't get a return to the defined benefit pensions, but they did get a boost of contributions to the 401ks and an increase in the multiplier for those who already do have the defined benefit pensions. They also gained the ability to strike over plant closures, which is huge. So if Ford wanted to announce that it wanted to close a plant because
Michigan
say because it needs to shift to making more EVs elsewhere, the workers would be able to strike over that.
Across the whole company?
I believe so. I need to check on that detail.
Okay, that's interesting. So, what you just laid out here sounds to me like it's a pretty good deal for the UAW, at least in the near term here. The question always, though, with these deals, Joe, is has the union bargained itself out of jobs in the future? Has it bargained Ford into a less competitive position in the marketplace? Ford UAW deal is estimated to cost Ford $900 million in the first year. The market today, trading Ford shares down so far 1.43%, although the market is down overall. So it's not crushing Ford stock by any means. But I think the question is, where does this leave Ford, which is losing a lot of money on its electric vehicle production in the future as it tries to compete with not just GM and Stellantis, but more importantly with the other companies like Toyota and Honda and BMW, which make cars in non-union areas that aren't subject to UAW contracts?
Paul, I think the problem with your question about how this affects Ford competitively is that fundamentally in these negotiations, the answer to that is always unknowable. I mean, that's the nature of a negotiation between labor and management, is that none of them can predict the future. And so both sides are trying to make their best guess about the maximum benefits that, labor, for example, can eke out while still keeping the company as a going concern, which is also in the union's interest. And this is the thing that has made me uncomfortable about this UAW strike all along, is that if we're in a situation where the big three increasingly are creatures of the government, both in terms of the degree of the mandates on electric vehicle production and other requirements and regulations that they labor under, but then also the degree of political interference, the history of receiving bailouts, the fact that President Biden was showing up in the picket line at one point. It raises this question about whether the two sides have actually negotiated this deal under that situation where none of them know what the future holds and both of them have a stake in keeping it going as a going concern in the private sector, versus is there sort of at the back of everyone's head now this hope or expectation that the government will step in at some point if the numbers don't work out in this deal?
Provocative question, Joe. I mean, I guess short of that kind of failure, Alicia, the option for Ford, and short of shutting down plants and moving them to Mexico or to Alabama, the way they can do it and reduce staffing and so on is through attrition and automation.
Right. And I think Ford has already been increasingly trying to automate and bring in robots into its plants to increase their efficiency. And they claim they're not replacing workers. Okay. The reason why Tesla is profitable, even though EVs for most automakers, I mean, Ford thinks it's going to lose about $4.5 billion on its EVs this year, but Tesla still has margins of around 15%, is because of its automation. We often talk about what are the differences in the labor costs per worker? And, the foreign automakers pay around $45 per hour, all in labor costs, versus the big three, which is around $65 per hour. But that doesn't actually consider how much actually labor goes into making each car, right? And so if you can reduce the amount of labor that goes into producing each car, even if you're not shaving your per worker costs, you can actually bring your overall operating costs down. And I suspect that's what Ford will end up doing, is that as workers leave or as workers retire, they just won't replace them, and they'll increasingly rely more on automation and robots.
All right. Ruminate on that number. $4.5 billion Ford expects to lose this year on its electric vehicle production. That ought to be something on the mind of shareholders. Also, I think the deal here, the tentative deal, is no doubt pleasing the White House, because Joe Biden didn't like the idea that this most pro-union of presidents had a strike on his hand. He wanted to see that the UAW succeeded, because he did, as Joe said, walk the picket lines. And at least on Ford, in the short term, he can say that has happened. All right. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch, and we hope to catch you tomorrow with a new edition of our podcast. Thanks for listening.